So this lesson is on economic justice. We've talked about this before in the context of talking about fairness, and it's probably also come up in some other contexts. But the idea here in this lesson has to do with justice as it relates to economics. That is, the distribution of wealth in society. And by wealth, we mean all of the benefits and burdens that are available to people who live in a society. So we think of money, of course, but also it includes holdings in real estate, such as land and buildings, and other forms of economic power, holding of means of production like factories or stocks and various other things. Um, but generally, when it's thought of in monetary terms because that's a number that we can put on things that shows things pretty clearly. So there's some idea that all the wealth, say, in a society, and we could focus on the United States here for the sake of argument, could be thought of as a pie that we could divide up in various ways. Maybe we could divide it all up equally, where each individual who's, say, at the table gets an equal sized slice of pie. Or maybe we divide it up such that larger people get a larger piece. Say dad gets a larger piece, and smaller people get a smaller piece, so the baby gets a very small piece. Or we could say, well, we divide it up based on other factors, like who's willing to fight for it, perhaps. Uh, and whoever could fight, maybe they get all the pie. Or maybe they decide once they get it, they're going to divide it up however they want to divide it up based on who sided with them or whatever. And so the idea here is that there's the pie and we can divide it up various ways. And of course, this is a humorous way to think about it, but you often see pie charts showing that the pie is obviously not equally distributed across society. In fact, a lot of people point out that it's rather unequally divided. And this unequal dividing up of the pie is referred to as economic inequality. And so we have people who are rich and people who are not rich. And people who are not rich would include the middle class and people who are below middle class, who would be often referred to as the poor, people in poverty. And so we call these in terms of socioeconomic status, like where you are in society in terms of the amount of wealth you have. Now, these are important because having wealth is not just about being able to party and go on trips and vacation. There's also health issues related to how much wealth one has. The more wealth one has, the more access and easier access one has to healthcare and quality healthcare. The more access and easier access one has to good education, the less likely one is to suffer from the negative effects of poverty, and so on. Now, there's a lot of facts that are mentioned in the textbook, and rather than just laboring those, you can look at those yourself, which is why the text exists as a resource in addition to what we're doing here. That you could look at one measure you could look at is the way the wealth is divided. You have the top 1%, according to these data from 2014, control a significant amount of the wealth compared to the bottom 40% of households. And you see there's quite a disparity there, that 1% controls so much more than this other group. And some people would think, well, this should be divided up in a way that's more fair. But the question becomes, what is fair? What is just in these terms? So once we start talking about what is just, we're asking about justice. And in this context, we're not talking about legal justice, which would be what the law requires, but rather what many people call social justice. And in this context, we're talking about a particular kind of social justice, which is social justice that has to do with the distribution of wealth in a society. For that reason, it's rightly called distributive justice. And there's different views on, well, what would be morally right? What would be the just way that things should be divided up? You may look at the visual that the chart had on the previous slide, which showed a very great inequality between what the people who have and the people who don't have, if you will, line up. Now, one view of distributive justice is called process or procedural distributive justice. And the idea here is that, well, as long as the process by which things are divided up is fair, then the outcome is not a question. It's not an issue. As long as we arrived at this income inequality through a fair process, there was no, say, forced fraud or theft going on, or some other kind of thing to rig the system, then we say, well, the outcome is fair. And of course, this ignores a lot of factors, but again, a lot of people say, well, as long as we have a fair process, it's fair, and so therefore it's just. Now, a different view is that, well, no, we shouldn't focus on how we got to where we are, and whether it's fair or not, but where we actually are, where we ended up at. And that's where a redistribution of wealth should possibly take place. If you take this sort of view, so, well, the way things are divided up is very unfair. Therefore, what we should do is to tax the very wealthy at a much higher tax rate and use that money for social programs and other things to help the people and so many people at the lower end. So, if I, for example, take several $1,000,000 from a wealthy person and give it to several people, I've helped maybe 100 people with this money, whereas the person who's very, very wealthy did not miss this money very much at all, given how much it was relative to their wealth. And so that's one idea, that's used to redistribute the wealth of society in such a way that more people are helped, because the idea is that, well, the way things have ended up is where we should think about justice, not necessarily the fairness of the process to begin with. Now, a different issue here has to do with equal opportunity, and the idea here is that, well, we should start at the same place. Now, neither the process or end state says anything about the starting point, because we can imagine having a fair process, but people not starting with the same amount. So people from very wealthy families obviously have a lot of advantages that people from very poor families do not. And so we may say, well, there could be some equal opportunity in the way things start out. And that would be the kind of distributive justice we have. And then people, you want to follow a fair process, but starting out with more consideration given to how people are starting out, to help them, say, through funding education, through taxation, and other sorts of things of that nature. Now, there's quite a bit in this chapter, and here when we, towards the end, we talk about political and economic theories, and you get what I would call a parade of isms. And I'm not going to go through each of these. Many of them are words you're going to hear a lot, and sometimes there's confusion about what exactly they mean. So it would be helpful if you did learn these as part of your general education. There's a libertarianism, capitalism, socialism, modern liberalism. There's Rawls theory, which we don't have an ism for that. Maybe we call it Rawlsianism. And then there's communitarianism. And some of these, especially the first four, are words that you probably hear sometimes fairly regularly, depending on how much news you watch and how much reading you do. And if you're also studying political science or history or things like that, you would encounter these words a lot. Again, the definitions of them and discussion of them are there in the text. So as we think about the pie, we can think about our views on the ethics of how things are divided up. We can think back to ethical theories we've covered in previous chapters if we wish to think about what would be the just process for dividing up the pie. And of course, everyone wants a slice of pie. Maybe some people are taking more of the pie than they rightly deserve, and maybe some people are not getting quite enough pie to satisfy them. Well, that concludes this mini lecture on economic justice.